There's a tablet sitting in a museum basement in Oxford. It's called the Weld-Blundell Prism, an 8-inch clay cylinder covered in wedge-shaped marks. Archaeologists catalogued it decades ago. Most visitors walk past its display case without a second glance. But if you could read the ancient script pressed into its surface, you'd find something remarkable. A list of kings, their names, their cities, the lengths of their reigns. The first king, it says, ruled for 28,800 years. Not 28 years, not even 288 years. 28,800 years. The second king's reign, 36,000 years. 8 kings total, ruling from 5 different cities for a combined 200 years. Then the text notes, almost casually, that a great flood swept over the land, and after the waters receded, kingship descended from the heavens once more and the counting began again. But this time the numbers changed. Post-flood kings ruled for hundreds of years instead of tens of thousands. Still impossible by modern standards, but a dramatic shift nonetheless. What makes this remarkable isn't just the impossible mathematics. It's that the same scribes who recorded these primordial reigns also tracked the orbit of Venus with precision that wouldn't be matched until the 20th century. They divided the day into hours, the hour into minutes, the circle into 360 degrees. They invented writing itself. These weren't primitive storytellers spinning campfire tales. They were meticulous bureaucrats, astronomers, engineers. Yet here they were, documenting reigns that would make a redwood tree look like an afternoon project. So tonight, as the day fades and your breathing slows, I'm going to take you back to that world, to the place where this strange accounting began, to a land between 2 rivers where the first cities rose from mud and reeds, where the first words were pressed into wet clay, where humanity took its first stumbling steps towards something we might call civilization. But also where, if the ancient records are to be believed, something else happened. Something that might explain not just those impossible numbers, but a more unsettling question. What if humanity wasn't supposed to last forever? What if we came with an expiration date? Close your eyes if you'd like. The world I'm building exists better in shadow, in the quiet space between memory and history. You won't need to see it to know it's there. Before we drift too far, though, a gentle invitation. If this resonates with you, a quiet like helps others find these stories in the strange algorithm of the night. And I'm curious, where in the world are you listening from as the hours grow late? What time is it there? Let me know in the comments. Your voices from across the globe always feel like messages in bottles, cast into the dark and somehow finding shore. And when you're ready for more, there are other ancient worlds waiting in the playlist, other mysteries that unfold at their own patient pace. Now, let the story breathe. Let it unfold in its own time. You're standing in southern Mesopotamia, in what would one day become Uruk. But this is long before those names existed, long before nations and borders carved up the world. This is approximately 3200 BCE, and you're witnessing something unprecedented in Earth's history. The first true cities, the first literate civilization, the first bureaucracies, the first contracts, the first laws written in stone. The city before you is called Uruk, and it sprawls across nearly 6 square kilometers. 50,000 people live within its walls, perhaps more. At this moment in time, it is the largest human settlement on the planet. The air smells of barley bread baking in communal ovens, of livestock in crowded pens, of human industry concentrated in a way it has never been before. This is the prototype, the original city. Every metropolis that would follow, from Athens to Rome to London to New York, is in some fundamental way descended from the sooted brick experiment in collective living. At the heart of the city rises a structure that dominates the skyline, that seems to organize all other buildings in relation to itself. It's a ziggurat, a stepped pyramid of sun-baked brick, climbing towards the sky in diminishing terraces. This particular one is dedicated to Inanna, the goddess of love and war. Though every major Sumerian city has one of these architectural mountains, they are called temples, places of worship, but they are also something more. Administrative centers, granaries, astronomical observatories, economic engines. The ziggurat is where the earthly and the divine supposedly meet, where the gods can descend from the heavens to dwell among their people. The gods, let's talk about them. The Sumerians called their primary deities the Anunnaki. The name, according to scholarly consensus, translates roughly to princely offspring or seed of royal blood. They were believed to be the children of An, the sky god, and Ki, the earth goddess. At the apex of this divine hierarchy sat a trinity of immense power, and himself distant and supreme, residing in the highest heaven. Enlil, the god of wind and air, who separated heaven from earth and became the executive power on the terrestrial plane, ruling from his temple at Nippur. And Enki, also known as Ea, the god of the subterranean freshwater ocean called the Abzu, master of wisdom, magic and craftsmanship. Beneath them were others. Ninhursag, the mother goddess, Inanna, who had become Ishtar in later Babylonian mythology, goddess of contradictions, love and war, fertility and destruction. Utu, the sun god, Nanna, the moon god. A complex pantheon with complex relationships, rivalries, love affairs, wars. They were not distant, abstract concepts. To the Sumerians, these beings were real, physical, with personalities and motivations as complex as any humans. They demanded worship, required feeding through sacrifices, could be pleased or angered. And here's what makes the Anunnaki fascinating from a mythological perspective. In most ancient creation myths, humans are created out of love, or accident, or divine loneliness. In the Sumerian text, particularly a composition called the Atrahasis, humanity is created to solve a labour dispute. The story goes like this. In the beginning, the work of the world was done by the Agigi, the lesser gods. They dug the rivers, dredged the canals, built the infrastructure of creation. This went on for thousands of years until finally the Agigi revolted. They burned their tools and surrounded Enlil's temple, refusing to work another day. Faced with this divine strike, the gods convened a council, and it was Enki, the clever one, who proposed the solution. Don't punish the Agigi. Instead, create a replacement workforce. Design a new being specifically to take over the hard labour. The mother goddess Nintu, also called Mami, was tasked with the creation. According to the text, she took clay from the Abzu, mixed it with the blood and spirit of a sacrificed god named Wa'ilu, a deity who possessed Te'ema, meaning intelligence or understanding. From this mixture, 14 clay and divine pieces were fashioned, 7 for males and 7 for females. These were implanted into the wombs of 14 birth goddesses who acted as surrogates. After a set gestation period, the first humans were born. This is not a gentle creation myth. This is engineering. Bioengineering, in fact, if you take the language at face value. A conscious blending of terrestrial material with divine essence to produce a hybrid being with just enough intelligence to follow instructions but not enough to question their purpose. We were made, these texts suggest, to be slaves. Our entire reason for existence, according to this story, was to toil so that the gods would not have to. Now, mainstream scholarship is quite clear about how to read these texts. They're mythology, symbolic narratives created by an agricultural society to explain the harsh realities of their existence. The Sumerians were farmers in a difficult land, entirely dependent on irrigation from the Tigris and Euphrates. Life was back-breaking work. Floods could wipe out a season's harvest in a day. Drought could starve a city. The myths reflect this as precariousness. The gods are powerful, capricious, demanding. Humanity exists in service to forces beyond its control. It's a theological framework for understanding suffering and social hierarchy. That's the academic consensus, and it's well-reasoned. But there's always a but. In 1976, a man named Zecharia Sitchin published a book called The 12th Planet. Sitchin was not an archaeologist or a professional linguist, though he claimed to read Sumerian cuneiform. He was a journalist and economic analyst born in Azerbaijan, raised in Palestine and London, self-taught in the ancient languages, and he proposed something audacious. He said that these texts were not myths, they were historical records, distorted certainly, filtered through primitive understanding and limited vocabulary, but fundamentally factual. According to Sitchin, the Anunnaki were not gods, they were extraterrestrial beings, a technologically advanced species from a planet he called Nibiru, which he claimed was the 12th body in our solar system, following a vast elliptical orbit that brought it into the inner solar system every 600 years. When Nibiru passed close to Earth roughly 450,000 years ago, the Anunnaki descended and established mining operations. They needed gold, Sitchin claimed, to repair the failing atmosphere of their home world. They intended to grind it into microscopic particles and suspend it in their stratosphere to reflect heat and light, saving their planet. But the mining was brutal. After millennia of labour, the Anunnaki miners mutinied. The solution? Create a worker race. Using advanced genetic engineering, they spliced their own DNA with that of Homo erectus, a hominid already evolving on Earth. The result was Homo sapiens, us. We were designed to mine gold. Our intelligence, our opposable thumbs, our capacity for language and tool use, all granted so we could better serve our masters. Sitchin's theory became a cornerstone of ancient astronaut theory, inspiring countless books, documentaries, television shows. It's been translated into dozens of languages, sold millions of copies. It's pervasive in popular culture. This idea that we are genetically engineered slave species created by spacefaring gods. It's also, according to virtually every credentialed scholar in the relevant fields, completely wrong. Not just wrong in its conclusions, but wrong in its fundamental readings of the source material. Dr. Michael Heiser, a scholar with a PhD in Hebrew and Semitic studies from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, has spent years systematically dismantling Sitchin's translations. He points out that when Sitchin translates Anunnaki as those who from heaven to earth came, he's simply fabricating a meaning. The actual translation, as one understood by Assyriologists who study these languages professionally, is princely offspring or princely seed. It's a designation of status, not origin. Similarly, Sitchin claims the Sumerian word Shem means rocket ship, sky chamber. Actual Sumerian dictionaries, including ancient bilingual dictionaries created by Akkadian scribes, translate Shem as name or monument. When the Anunnaki are concerned with making a Shem for themselves, they're concerned with establishing their reputation, not building spacecraft. The claim that Nibiru is a planet beyond Pluto also doesn't appear in any ancient text. The word Nibiru is Akkadian, not Sumerian, and it means crossing point or ferry. In Babylonian astronomical texts, Nibiru refers to Jupiter, or in some contexts to a celestial marker used to track the movement of other planets. It was never described as a rogue planet with a 3,600-year orbit. That's Sitchin's invention. And the famous cylinder seal VA243, which Sitchin claimed depicts the solar system with 12 planets. Experts who can actually read the seal's inscription say it belongs to a servant named Atta and shows a standard presentation scene with stars, not planets. The sun symbol Sitchin identifies isn't even the correct symbol for the sun in Sumerian iconography. The academic criticisms go deeper. Sitchin frequently quotes texts out of context, truncates quotations to change their meaning, and ignores contradictory evidence. His work has been called pseudo-archaeology, pseudo-science, and deliberate misrepresentation by historians, Sumerologists, linguists, astronomers, and biologists alike. The scholarly consensus is overwhelming and unified. Sitchin's narrative, while compelling, is built on a foundation of mistranslations and fabrications, so we're left with a myth. A powerful ancient creation story about humanity being fashioned from clay and divine blood to serve as a workforce for demanding gods, nothing more. Except. That word again, except. Let's set aside Sitchin entirely. Let's return to the actual texts, read by actual scholars, in their actual context. And let's ask a different question. Not whether the Anunnaki were aliens, but what these stories reveal about how the Sumerians understood their own existence and their relationship to time, power, and mortality. Because here's something that gets lost in the debate between ancient astronaut theorists and academic skeptics. Both sides are so focused on whether the texts are literally true or completely fictional that they miss a more interesting possibility. What if these texts are neither pure invention nor pure history, but something in between? What if they're cultural memory, distorted by time and filtered through mythological frameworks, but preserving echoes of real events and real changes in human society? Consider how oral traditions work. Before writing, stories were passed down verbally, generation after generation. Each retelling introduced changes. Details were forgotten, embellished, merged with other stories, names changed, motivations were reinterpreted through the lens of the current culture. But the core narrative often persisted for hundreds or even thousands of years. We know this from studies of indigenous oral traditions in Australia, which preserve remarkably accurate information about geography, climate, and events from over 10,000 years ago, from the end of the last ice age, when sea levels were rising and coastlines were dramatically different. The Sumerians were the first to write these stories down, around 3200 BCE, but the stories themselves were certainly older. How much older, we don't know. They could stretch back hundreds or even thousands of years before the invention of writing, preserved in oral form, passed down through generations of storytellers who were the living libraries of their culture. So when we read about the Anunnaki creating humanity, what are we actually reading? Maybe not a literal account of genetic engineering, but perhaps a mythologized memory of the transition from hunter-gatherer societies to agricultural civilizations. That transition, which happened in Mesopotamia around 10,000 BCE, was as revolutionary as any alien intervention could be. It transformed human society completely. Population exploded, social hierarchies emerged, specialist craftspeople appeared, surplus food production allowed for the creation of cities, armies, priesthoods, bureaucracies. Humanity became something it had never been before. From the perspective of someone living after that revolution, looking back at the simpler, freer hunter-gatherer past, it might seem like a transformation so fundamental that it couldn't have been natural. Something must have caused it. Someone must have created this new type of human, this agricultural, city-dwelling, surplus-producing, hierarchy-accepting being. The gods did it. The Anunnaki did it. We were made deliberately to be this way. And there's a truth to that, even if the mechanism wasn't alien genetic engineering. We were made, not by beings from another planet, but by our own choices, compounded over generations. The decision to cultivate crops instead of foraging. The decision to domesticate animals. The decision to settle in one place and build permanent structures. The decision to accept social hierarchies in exchange for security and surplus. These decisions, made by our ancestors over thousands of years, created us as surely as any deliberate design. We domesticated plants and animals, but in the process, we also domesticated ourselves. We changed our own nature to fit the new agricultural lifestyle. We became less physically robust, more disease-prone. Epidemics are a feature of dense populations, more dependent on infrastructure and social systems, more accepting of authority and hierarchy. We traded freedom for stability. We became, in a sense, slaves to the civilizational machine we built. The Sumerian myths encode this transition, not literally, but metaphorically. We were free once, living in the wilderness, the Eden, taking what we needed from nature. Then something changed. We gained knowledge, yes, the knowledge of agriculture, of animal husbandry, of brick-making and irrigation and city planning. But we also lost something. We lost the simplicity and autonomy of the hunter-gatherer life. We became bound to the land we farmed, dependent on the crops we grew, subject to the kings and priests who organized the surplus. We became workers. The texts say the gods made us to toil in the fields and dig the canals. And in a sense, that's exactly what happened. We made ourselves into agricultural labourers. The gods are us, or more precisely, they're the personification of the social and technological forces that shaped us. This is a more sophisticated reading than either the ancient astronaut theory or the dismissive, it's just primitive mythology approach. It treats the texts as valuable historical documents that preserve cultural memory in mythological form. The details may be fantastical, but the pattern is real. Something happened that transformed humanity. And that transformation felt so profound, so discontinuous with the past, that it seemed to require divine intervention to explain. Now let's apply this same lens to the other elements of the myths. The declining lifespans, the Great Flood, the periodic cullings. What real events or patterns might these mythological elements preserve? The declining lifespans in the king list might reflect several things. It could be a literary device to show increasing realism as the list moves from mythical past to historical present. The further back you go, the more exaggerated the claims, until eventually you reach recorded history and verifiable facts. This is common in ancient chronicles, but it might also reflect a genuine belief that earlier humans lived longer, which appears in many ancient cultures. The biblical patriarchs, the long-lived sages of Vedic texts, the extended ages of Greek mythological heroes. Why is this belief so widespread? One possibility is environmental change. If post-glacial climates were significantly different, with different disease vectors, different nutrition availability, different exposure to toxins, average human lifespans could have varied more than we assume. We know that the shift to agriculture initially decreased health outcomes for most people. Hunter-gatherers were generally taller, stronger, and healthier than early agriculturalists, who suffered from malnutrition, repetitive stress injuries, and epidemic diseases. Perhaps there is a dim memory of a time when people were indeed healthier and longer lived, before the agricultural revolution made them shorter and sicker. Another possibility is that age in these texts doesn't mean what we think it means. Perhaps the numbers represent something else entirely. Cycles of Venus, which was carefully tracked by Mesopotamian astronomers. Generations, rather than years. Symbolic values, or even accounting of some kind, where the age is actually a tally of accumulated goods, tribute collected, years of rule multiplied by the number of subjects, creating inflated numbers that were never meant to be taken as literal lifespans. The point is, dismissing these numbers as pure fantasy misses the fact that they're part of a coherent system. They follow patterns. They change in specific ways at specific points in the timeline. They're tracking something, even if we're not entirely sure what. And then there's the flood. Let's spend more time here, because this is where mythology and hard science intersect in fascinating ways. Flood myths are ubiquitous. The Mesopotamian account preserved in the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Atrahasis, the biblical Noah and the Ark, the Greek story of Deucalion and Pyrrha, the Hindu Manu who builds a boat after being warned by a fish avatar of Vishnu, the Chinese legend of Gun Yu controlling the Great Flood, indigenous Australian stories of rising seas drowning coastal lands, Native American legends of world-flooding waters, Polynesian myths of islands submerged. African, Mesoamerican, Northern European traditions all include catastrophic flood narratives. For a long time, scholars treated these as independent inventions arising from localized flood experiences. Every river valley civilization experiences floods. They are terrifying, destructive, memorable. It's natural that cultures would develop myths about ultimate floods, world-ending deluges that required divine intervention to survive. This made sense. It was tidy. It didn't require any extraordinary explanations. But then the geologists started reconstructing the end of the last ice age, and a different picture emerged. Between about 20,000 and 7,000 years ago, global subtotal sea levels rose approximately 20 meters. This wasn't a single event. It was a long, irregular process with periods of rapid rise and periods of stability, but the net effect was enormous. Vast areas of what had been dry land were inundated. The land bridge between Asia and North America disappeared under the Bering Strait. Britain was cut off from continental Europe. The Persian Gulf, which had been a fertile river valley, became a vast shallow sea. The Black Sea, according to one controversial theory, was a freshwater lake until around 5600 BCE when rising Mediterranean waters breached the Bosphorus, flooding it in what might have been a catastrophic torrent, visible and audible for hundreds of kilometres. If humans were living in these coastal areas, which they almost certainly were because coasts are prime real estate for hunter-gatherers, with access to both marine and terrestrial resources, then they would have witnessed land disappearing underwater. Not in a single 40-day deluge, but over generations and centuries. Grandparents remembering shorelines that were now kilometres out to sea, islands vanishing, river valleys drowning. It would have seemed like the world was being swallowed. And then there's the Younger Dryas. This is where things get really interesting. Around 12 to 900 years ago, the Earth was warming, emerging from the last glacial maximum. Temperatures were rising, ice sheets were retreating, sea levels were starting their long climb. Then suddenly, catastrophically, temperatures plunged again. In some regions, the drop was as much as 15 degrees Celsius in less than a decade. The world was thrown back into near-glacial conditions. This lasted for about 1,300 years, until around 11,600 years ago, when temperatures suddenly soared again, even more abruptly than they'd fallen. What caused this climatic whiplash? For years, the leading theory was meltwater from retreating ice sheets flooding into the North Atlantic, disrupting the thermohaline circulation, the ocean conveyor belt that distributes heat around the planet. But that theory had problems. It didn't explain all the evidence. The timing was off. The geographic extent was too broad. Something else must have happened. Enter the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. First seriously proposed in 2007 by a team of researchers led by Richard Firestone. They suggested that around 12 to 900 years ago, a comet or asteroid, or more likely a swarm of fragments from a disintegrating comet, struck Earth. The evidence they pointed to includes a thin layer found at sites across North America, Europe, and Asia, dated precisely to the beginning of the Younger Dryas. This layer contains several markers consistent with extraterrestrial impact, nanodiamonds, which form under extreme pressure. High concentrations of platinum, iridium, and other rare earth elements common in asteroids and comets but rare on Earth's surface. Magnetic spherules, tiny balls of melted rock, shocked quartz, and massive amounts of charcoal indicating continent-scale wildfires. The hypothesis suggests that fragments, perhaps dozens or hundreds of them, rained down across the northern hemisphere. Most struck the Laurentide ice sheet covering North America. These impacts would have instantly melted enormous volumes of ice, releasing catastrophic floods. They would have lofted massive amounts of water vapour, dust and ice particles into the atmosphere, blocking sunlight and triggering rapid cooling. The fires ignited by the impacts would have burned vast territories, adding soot to the atmospheric loading. The combined effect would have been an impact winter that lasted over a millennium. This hypothesis remains controversial. Not all geologists accept it. There are debates about whether the markers really indicate impact, whether they're at the right dates, whether the distributions make sense, but the evidence keeps accumulating. More sites with the characteristic layer are being found. The markers are being confirmed by independent labs. The chronology is being refined and seems to hold up. A growing number of researchers think something genuinely catastrophic happened at the Younger Dryas boundary, and that impact is the best explanation. If this is true, if Earth was struck by a fragmented comet 12,900 years ago, then humanity lived through an apocalypse, not a metaphorical one, a literal, planet-wide catastrophe. The impacts themselves would have been visible across vast distances, brilliant fireballs in the sky. The sound would have been deafening. The ground would have shaken. Then the fires burning uncontrollably across the landscape. Then the floods as melted ice surged through river systems. Then the cold as the sun was blotted out by atmospheric debris. Then centuries of harsh, unstable climate. Then the extinctions, the megafauna that had survived the entire ice age dying off within a few centuries. Mammoths, mastodons, giant sloths, saber-toothed cats, cave bears, all gone, and human populations crashing, cultures disappearing, the Clovis people of North America vanishing from the archaeological record at precisely this boundary. If you survived this, what story would you tell? You'd tell a story of the world ending, of fire from the sky and waters covering the earth, of only a few surviving in specially prepared refuges while everything around them was destroyed. And you'd pass that story down, generation after generation, because it would be the most important thing your people ever experienced. It would define your culture. It would shape your world view. The world ended once, it could end again. Be prepared. Remember what happened. Don't forget. And over thousands of years that story would change. It would be filtered through the beliefs and concerns of each generation. The scientific details would be lost, replaced by theological explanations. The impacts became divine wrath. The survivors became chosen by the gods. The rebuilding became a new creation. But the core memory remained. The world ended in fire and flood. Some of us survived. This is how we rebuild. This is what we might be seeing in the flood myths. Not literal accounts, but mythologized memories of a real catastrophe. The Mesopotamian flood story is particularly interesting because it contains details that are hard to explain as pure invention. The specific dimensions of the ark given in cubits, the exact duration of the flood, 6 days and 7 nights of rain, then 100 days of waters prevailing, then gradual subsidence. The sending out of birds to test for dry land, first a dove, then a swallow, then a raven. These feel like real details, the kind of specifics that survive in oral tradition because they're tied to actual events and actual procedures. Could Utnapishtim or his real-world analogue have actually built a large boat and survived a catastrophic flood by riding it out? Could there have been a real individual living in southern Mesopotamia around the time of the Younger Dryas who had the foresight or luck to prepare for disaster and become the ancestor of the post-catastrophe population? It's not impossible. In fact, it's more plausible than the alternative, that someone invented all these details from whole cloth for no particular reason. But whether or not there was a historical Utnapishtim, the myth serves a crucial function. It preserves the memory that catastrophe has happened before and can happen again. It encodes survival knowledge, build boats, preserve food, save seeds and animals, choose high ground, watch for signs. These are practical instructions wrapped in theological narrative. The gods decided to send a flood, yes, but more importantly, here's how you survive one if it happened. Puns again. And this brings us back to the expiration date question. because embedded in these myths is a warning. Humanity is fragile. Civilizations are fragile. We exist at the mercy of forces vastly more powerful than ourselves. Divine wrath in the ancient framework, cosmic impacts, supervolcano eruptions, climate shifts, pandemic diseases, nuclear war, artificial intelligence, ecological collapse in our modern framework. The specific threat changes, but the underlying reality doesn't. We could end. Our civilization could end. We should not assume continuity. We should prepare. We should remember. We should tell the stories so that future generations know that the world has ended before and can end again. The expiration date isn't a specific date. It's a recognition of contingency. We're here now, but there's no guarantee we'll be here tomorrow. Not because alien gods might return and judge us unworthy, but because the universe is full of hazards and we're vulnerable to most of them. An asteroid, a supervolcano, a nearby gamma ray burst, a pandemic more lethal than any we've faced, a technological disaster, a cascade of environmental failures, a war that gets out of control. Any of these could end us, or at least end our current configuration as a global technological civilization. The Anunnaki myths, understood this way, are not about alien control. They're about human vulnerability and the need for humility. We're not masters of our fate. We're subject to powers beyond our control, whether you call those powers gods or natural forces. Our civilizations rise and fall, our lifespans are limited, our time is finite. The myths keep reminding us of this over and over in different ways. The declining ages in the king list, the periodic floods that reset civilization, the gods who can destroy what they created. It's all pointing to the same fundamental truth that we are temporary, and we should act accordingly with wisdom, with preparation, with the understanding that nothing is guaranteed. Modern civilization, particularly in the developed world, has largely forgotten this. We assume stability, we assume progress. We assume that tomorrow will be more or less like today, only slightly better. Our infrastructure, our economic systems, our social institutions, all built on the assumption of continuity. But that assumption is historically anomalous. For most of human history, people lived with the knowledge that everything could change catastrophically without warning, that the harvest could fail, that the barbarians could come, that the plague could strike, that the volcano could erupt, that the world as they knew it could end. We've been lucky for a few generations to live in a period of relative stability, but stability is not the norm. It's the exception, and it may be ending. Climate change, resource depletion, biodiversity loss, political instability, technological disruption, these are not hypothetical future problems. They're current realities, accelerating, interconnecting, creating a complex system that's increasingly unpredictable and potentially unstable. We might be living at the end of an age, not because ancient gods are returning, but because the conditions that allowed our current civilization to flourish are changing and we're not adapting fast enough. If that's true, if we're approaching another reset, another turning point in human history, then the ancient myths become newly relevant, not as prophecy, but as precedent. This has happened before. Civilizations have collapsed, populations have crashed, knowledge has been lost, but humanity survived. Some people made it through, preserved what they could, rebuilt in new forms, kept the chain of consciousness unbroken. The myths tell us this is possible. They also tell us what it costs. The loss is immense. The Dark Age can last centuries. But extinction is not inevitable. Continuation is possible. If we're wise, if we prepare, if we remember. That's the real message of the Anunnaki myths and the king list and the flood stories. Pay attention. History is not linear. Civilizations end. Be ready. Preserve knowledge. Build resilience. Don't assume stability. And when the change comes, as it inevitably will, have a plan. Have an arc, literally or metaphorically. Have a way to carry the seed of civilization forward into whatever comes next. Because something is always coming next. That's the other side of the expiration date. Yes, this configuration ends, but something else begins. The cycle continues. The experiment runs forward. New forms emerge from the ruins of the old. And if we're smart, if we're lucky, if we're prepared, then we get to be part of that next phase, not as victims of catastrophe, but as ancestors of the future. Not as the generation that failed, but as the generation that adapted, that survived, that kept the light burning through the darkness. Go back to that king list. The Weld-Blundell Prism. 8 antediluvian kings ruling for a total of 240,200 years. then a flood, then a reset, then kings with lifespans that gradually diminish until they're almost human. Almost believable. Scholars have various explanations for these impossible numbers. Some suggest they're symbolic, representing not years but something else, some unit of greatness or divine favour. Some propose they're the result of a mathematical error, a confusion between different numerical bases, perhaps a decimal system being misread as sexagesimal or base 60. There's an interesting study by Raul Lopez that shows if you take the biblical patriarchs' ages from Genesis and round them to 2 significant digits, then mistakenly read them as base 60 numbers instead of base 10, you get something very close to the Sumerian king list totals. It's compelling mathematics. It suggests a shared source that got corrupted in different directions. But here's the thing about the king list that no mathematical sleight of hand can explain away. It changes, abruptly. After the flood, the reigns drop from tens of thousands of years to hundreds. The first post-flood king rules for 100 years. Still impossible, but a dramatic reduction. As you move further down the list, the reigns keep shrinking. Eventually you get to Gilgamesh, the legendary king of Uruk, who appears on the list with a reign of 126 years. Gilgamesh is a semi-historical figure. There's evidence he actually existed. And 126 years, while unlikely, is at least within the realm of extreme human possibility. So the list is tracking something. Some kind of decline, some diminishment happening over time. It records a world where something that once lived for tens of millennia is reduced over successive generations to centuries, then to recognisably human lifespans. What are we looking at? Collective memory of genetic degradation? A metaphor for the fading influence of the gods as humanity became more autonomous? A literal belief that earlier generations lived far longer, which is also found in Genesis, in Vedic texts, in mythologies around the world? Or could it be documenting something stranger, some real change in human biology or environment that we don't understand? There are theories, fringe but persistent, that suggest the pre-flood world had different atmospheric conditions. A vapour canopy that filtered radiation, increased oxygen levels, created optimal conditions for extreme longevity. The flood in this model wasn't just water. It was the collapse of that protective layer, exposing the post-diluvian world to harsher conditions that shortened lifespans. It sounds fantastical. But let's sit with the discomfort for a moment. Because what if there's a kernel of something real buried in these myths? Not aliens, not literal divine beings, but a record of something that actually happened to our species, something that changed us in a fundamental way. Because here's something we need to talk about, something that connects to the myths about sudden creation and divine intervention. There's a discontinuity in the human archaeological record that's hard to explain with gradual evolution alone. It's called the Upper Paleolithic Revolution, or more broadly, the emergence of behavioural modernity. And it's weird. For the vast majority of our species' existence, anatomically modern humans, people who looked like us, had skulls like ours, had brains as large as ours, these people existed but didn't act particularly modern. The archaeological record from between 300,000 and 70,000 years ago shows Homo sapiens making stone tools. Simple stone tools, the same style of tools, unchanged, for hundreds of thousands of years. No art, no jewellery, no complex projectile weapons, no evidence of symbolic thought. No burial practices that suggest belief in an afterlife. Just tools, food, survival. Then, roughly between 70,000 and 40,000 years ago, something changed. Suddenly, or at least suddenly in archaeological terms, we see an explosion of innovation. More sophisticated stone tool technologies. Bone tools, carefully carved and shaped, needles for sewing clothing, spear throwers and bows for long-range hunting, fish hooks, elaborate beads and ornaments, red ochre used for body painting or ritual purposes, cave paintings of stunning sophistication and beauty, carved figurines, musical instruments, flutes made from bone, long-distance trade networks evidenced by shells and stones transported hundreds of kilometres from their sources, elaborate burial practices, bodies carefully arranged, decorated with jewellery and ochre, provided with grave goods for an imagined afterlife. This is behavioural modernity. This is what makes us recognisably us. Tool use, yes, but also art, music, ritual, trade, fashion, religion. Symbolic thought. The ability to imagine things that don't exist and then bring them into existence. The ability to create mental models of other people's minds and predict their behaviour. The ability to plan for the future. to tell stories about the past, to create meaning in an indifferent universe. And it appears quite suddenly in the archaeological record. For 250,000 years, nothing. Then in the span of 30,000 years, which is a blink in evolutionary time, everything. All at once, the full suite of modern human behaviour. What caused this? That's one of the great debates in paleoanthropology. There are several competing theories, none entirely satisfactory. One theory is that it was a genetic change. Some crucial mutation or set of mutations occurred that rewired the brain in a way that enabled symbolic thought and language at modern levels of complexity. This mutation spread through the population, and anyone who had it had such a massive selective advantage that it swept to fixation rapidly. The problem with this theory is that we haven't identified any obvious genetic changes that occurred at the right time. The human genome doesn't show evidence of recent positive selection strong enough and recent enough to account for the behavioural revolution. There are a few candidate genes related to brain development that show signs of selection in human lineages, like FOXP2, which is associated with language, or ASPM and MCPH1, which are associated with brain size. But these genes are ancient, shared with Neanderthals and earlier hominins. They don't explain why behavioural modernity appeared when it did. Another theory is that the cognitive capacity was always there, latent in the hardware, and what changed was software. Cultural evolution, not genetic evolution. Perhaps language reached a threshold of complexity that allowed for the full transmission of knowledge and ideas. Perhaps population size reached a critical mass where innovations were more likely to spread and accumulate rather than being lost when individuals died. Perhaps social structures changed in a way that allowed for specialization, where not everyone had to spend all their time on basic survival, and some people could focus on creating art, making better tools, experimenting with new technologies. This theory has the advantage of not requiring mysterious genetic changes we can't find. But it has the disadvantage of not explaining what triggered the cultural change, or why it took 250,000 years for humans to invent art and symbolism if they were always capable of it. A third theory, more controversial, is that there wasn't a single revolution. That behavioural modernity emerged gradually, sporadically, in different populations at different times, and what we're seeing in the archaeological record is preservation bias. Maybe earlier populations were creating art and jewellery and engaging in symbolic behaviour, but they were doing it with the organic materials that didn't preserve wood and plants and animal skins, and we only start seeing it around 70,000 years ago because that's when they started using stone and shell and bone and ochre, materials that survive in the ground. This theory is gaining some support from recent discoveries. We found shell beads in South Africa and North Africa, dated to over 100,000 years ago. We found evidence of red ochre use going back even further. So maybe the revolution wasn't as sudden as we thought. Maybe it was gradual, and we're only now starting to find the earlier evidence. But even if behavioural modernity emerged gradually rather than suddenly, the fact remains that something fundamental changed in human culture and cognition at some point in our history. We went from being smart apes to being something unprecedented on this planet. A species that doesn't just adapt to environments but actively transforms them. A species that creates cultural worlds, symbolic realities, shared fictions that allow us to cooperate in groups of millions and billions. A species that can imagine futures that don't exist yet and then build them. A species that asks questions like, why are we here? And what happens when we die? And then spends thousands of years creating elaborate answers. This transformation, whenever and however it happened, is what the Anunnaki myths might be preserving a memory of. Not a literal genetic engineering event by alien beings, but the transition from archaic Homo sapiens to behaviourally modern humans. From our perspective, looking back across thousands of generations, that transition might seem so profound, so discontinuous, that it required a special explanation. We weren't always this way. Once we were simpler, more like animals, then something happened. The gods came. They gave us knowledge. They made us human. The myths are trying to explain the transformation, using the conceptual tools available to pre-scientific cultures. Divine intervention makes more sense than genetic drift and cultural evolution if you don't have those concepts. And here's where things get interesting from a modern perspective. We're potentially on the verge of another transition. We're developing technologies that could fundamentally transform human cognition and capability. Brain-computer interfaces, genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, pharmaceuticals that enhance cognition, life extension technologies, the merger of human and machine intelligence. Within the next century, possibly within the next few decades, we might create post-human beings, entities that are descended from us but are as far beyond current humanity as we are beyond our Australopithecine ancestors. If that happens, if we successfully engineer a transition to a new kind of being, what stories will they tell about us? Will we be remembered as gods who created them? Will the messy, contingent process of technological development be mythologized into a purposeful act of divine creation? Will they wonder if they have an expiration date? If their makers designed them with planned obsolescence? If they're here for a purpose or just because it was possible? And most unsettling, what if we fail? What if the transition goes wrong? What if we create AI that doesn't serve human interests? What if genetic engineering produces unintended consequences? What if brain-computer interfaces lead to new forms of addiction, control, or mental illness? What if life extension creates insurmountable social problems? What if the post-human future is dystopian rather than utopian? Then the next species, or the next iteration of humanity if we survive, might tell very different stories about us. We might become the Anunnaki, the ancient creators who built them for their own purposes, who gave them consciousness and capability but also embedded suffering and limitation, who set them on a path that might lead to flourishing or might lead to extinction, who are remembered with a mixture of gratitude and resentment, who left behind ruins and warnings. This is the recursive nature of the creation myth. Every generation creates the next, for better or worse. Every generation is both created and creator. They are the Anunnaki's offspring in the sense that we're the product of all the choices and accidents that came before. And we will be the Anunnaki to whatever comes after, shaping the future through our actions and inactions, our wisdom and folly, our compassion and cruelty. The expiration date applies not just to us, but to our role as ancestors. We have a limited window to influence what comes next. Our civilization will end, one way or another. The question is, what we leave behind. Do we leave viable seeds that can grow into new forms of complexity and consciousness? Do we leave knowledge and wisdom that can guide our successors? Do we leave a planet capable of supporting life? Or do we leave nothing but ruins and warnings, an extinct species and a degraded biosphere? The Sumerians faced this question in their own way. They were among the first urban civilizations, and they had to grapple with the responsibilities and dangers of concentrated power and population. They developed writing to record and transmit knowledge. They developed law codes to regulate behavior and resolve conflicts. They developed astronomical observations to track cycles and predict events. They were trying to build something that would last, that would persist beyond their individual lives and even beyond their civilization. And in a sense, they succeeded. Their cities are gone, but their ideas persist. Cuneiform writing was lost for millennia, but has been redeciphered. We can read their thoughts, hear their anxieties, understand their worldview. They are not alive, but they're not entirely dead either. They exist in the traces they left, the influence they had on subsequent cultures, the questions they asked that we're still asking. That's a form of immortality, not personal, not physical, but cultural. The information you produce, the ideas you have, the art you create, the love you give, the knowledge you share, these things propagate forward. They influence the future in ways you can't predict or control. You become part of the substrate on which the future is built, not as an individual, but as a contributor to the collective project of human civilization. And maybe that's enough. Maybe the answer to the expiration date question is not to seek personal immortality or even civilizational permanence, but to focus on being a good ancestor, to make choices that benefit not just yourself or your immediate community, but the long-term trajectory of humanity and life on Earth, to preserve knowledge, create beauty, reduce suffering, increase resilience, expand possibilities, to be the kind of ancestor you wish you'd had. The Anunnaki myths, understood this way, are not about alien control, but about intergenerational responsibility. The gods created us, and they have responsibilities toward their creation. Similarly, we create the future, and we have responsibilities toward it. We're not passive recipients of destiny, we're active shapers of what comes next. The expiration date is real, but it's not predetermined. We have agency, collectively, if not individually. We can influence the odds, we can try to be wise, we can work to ensure that something valuable survives whatever transitions or catastrophes lie ahead. This is the practical meaning of the myths. Not that we should worship ancient gods or prepare for alien return, but that we should take seriously the lessons encoded in these old stories. Civilizations rise and fall, catastrophes happen, nothing is permanent, but survival is possible, continuation is possible, if we're prepared, if we remember, if we act as though future generations matter, if we embrace our role as ancestors. Consider the genetic evidence. In 2001, the Human Genome Project published its first draft of the complete human genome. It was a triumph of science, the culmination of over a decade of work by thousands of researchers across the globe. But it also revealed something unexpected. Researchers identified approximately 223 genes that appeared to have no evolutionary predecessors in the genomic tree. They seemed to have no clear ancestral lineage among other primates or mammals. The initial suggestion was that these genes may have arrived via horizontal gene transfer from bacteria. This was controversial headline-making science. Horizontal or lateral gene transfer is well established in prokaryotes, in bacteria and archaea. It's how antibiotic resistance spreads so rapidly, genes jumping from one species to another through plasmids, viruses, or direct DNA uptake. But in complex multicellular organisms like humans, that's much rarer. We have elaborate systems to prevent foreign DNA from integrating into our germline. The nucleus is protected. The germline cells are segregated from somatic cells early in development. The whole architecture of eukaryotic cells is designed to maintain genetic integrity across generations. And yet horizontal gene transfer does occur in eukaryotes. We know this now. Mobile genetic elements called transposons can jump between genomes. Some organisms, particularly those with close relationships like parasites and hosts, exchange genes. There are documented cases of genes moving between species of insects, between fungi and plants, between bacteria and arthropods. It's not common, but it's not impossible. The specific claim about 223 human genes, though, didn't hold up under scrutiny. Subsequent research was more cautious. A 2002 study by Steven Salzberg and others at the Institute for Genomic Research argued that the original count was inflated. Better comparative databases, more complete genome sequences from other organisms, and more sophisticated phylogenetic analysis reduced the number of strong candidates for horizontal gene transfer from 23 down to about 4. And even those 40 could be explained by other mechanisms. Gene loss in some lineages but preservation in others could create the appearance of horizontal transfer when there was actually just differential retention of ancestral genes. Evolutionary rate variation, where some genes evolve much faster in some lineages than others, could make phylogenetic relationships hard to trace. Contamination in the databases or sequencing errors could create false positives. The scientific consensus now is that lateral gene transfer from prokaryotes to humans, while it may have occurred in rare instances, is not a major feature of human evolutionary history and certainly doesn't account for the sudden emergence of human intelligence or any other supposedly anomalous human traits. We got our genes through normal vertical transmission, parent to offspring with modification through mutation, recombination, and selection. That's the boring, well-supported, scientifically solid explanation. But, and there's always a but, the process of investigating those 23 genes revealed something fascinating about the human genome. It's a chimera. Not in the mythological sense of a creature made from parts of different animals, but in the sense that our genome is a palimpsest, layer upon layer of evolutionary history, with genes and sequences borrowed, stolen, co-opted, duplicated and modified from viruses, bacteria, archaea, and other eukaryotes over billions of years. About 8% of the human genome consists of endogenous retroviruses, ERVs. These are the remnants of ancient viral infections that inserted their DNA into our ancestors' germline cells and got passed down to us. They're mostly inactive now, degraded by mutations over millions of years. But they're there, permanent passengers in our genome, evidence of countless viral invasions over the course of vertebrate evolution. Some of them even serve useful functions. The syncytin genes, which are essential for placental development in mammals, are derived from retroviral envelope proteins. We literally couldn't reproduce without genes we stole from viruses. Then there are the transposable elements, TEs. These are stretches of DNA that can copy themselves and insert the copies elsewhere in the genome. They're sometimes called selfish genes because they exist primarily to replicate themselves, not to benefit the organism. About 45% of the human genome consists of transposable elements or the degraded remnants of transposable elements. They've shaped our evolutionary history in profound ways, creating genetic variation, driving chromosomal rearrangements, occasionally giving rise to new genes with new functions. The picture that emerges is not of a pristinely designed genome, carefully engineered by intelligent beings. It's a messy, cobbled together, historically contingent genome that bears all the marks of billions of years of evolution by natural selection. There's redundancy, inefficiency, vestigial sequences that serve no function, broken genes, viral insertions, repetitive elements copied thousands of times. It's exactly what you'd expect from an unguided process of descent with modification, not what you'd expect from intelligent design. And yet this air-sea, cobbled-together genome produces consciousness. It produces you, a being capable of reading about its own genome, understanding how it works, even editing it with tools like CRISPR. That's extraordinary, not because it required divine or alien intervention, but because it shows what natural processes can achieve given enough time and enough iterative selection. Complexity can emerge from simple rules applied repeatedly. Intelligence can evolve from non-intelligent processes. You can get consciousness from chemistry. But let's talk about the things that are genuinely unusual about human genetics, the features that distinguish us from other great apes, and that might have some relevance to the broader question of whether there's anything special about humanity that requires extraordinary explanation. First, there's chromosome 2. Humans have 46 chromosomes, arranged in 23 pairs. All other great apes, chimpanzees, bonobos, gorillas, orangutans, have 48 chromosomes, 24 pairs. This might seem like a fundamental difference, evidence that we're not related. But when you look closer, you find something remarkable. Human chromosome 2 is a fusion of two ancestral chromosomes. You can see the fusion site right in the middle of the chromosome. There are telomere sequences, which normally appear only at the tips of chromosomes, in the middle of chromosome 2. There's a remnant of a centromere, the structure that helps chromosomes separate during cell division, also in the interior where it shouldn't be. The DNA sequence of human chromosome 2 matches, almost perfectly, the sequence of two separate chromosomes in chimpanzees. What this means is that at some point after the human lineage split from the common ancestor we share with chimpanzees, two chromosomes in our ancestor accidentally fused end to end. And instead of this being lethal or disadvantageous, which you might expect, it persisted. It became fixed in the population. Everyone with human ancestry has this fused chromosome. This is one of the most powerful pieces of evidence for common descent because it's exactly the kind of thing you can't fake or explain away. The fusion scar is right there, visible, documented, confirmable in every human genome. But it also means that something unusual happened in our lineage. Chromosomal rearrangements can cause problems. They can lead to infertility if organisms with different chromosomal configurations try to breed. The fact that a fusion this significant became fixed in the population suggests either a genetic bottleneck, where the population size got very small and the fusion got lucky, or some selective advantage that made it beneficial despite the potential costs. We don't know which, but it's notable. It's a mark of something unusual in human evolutionary history. Second, there's the human brain. This is the really interesting part, the part that potentially connects to the mythological narratives about humanity being somehow special or designed. Between roughly 3 million and 200,000 years ago, hominin brain size increased dramatically. Our Australopithecine ancestors had brains around 400 to 500 cubic centimetres, about the same as modern chimpanzees. By the time Homo erectus appeared around 2 million years ago, brain size had increased to about 900 cc. By the time Homo heidelbergensis appeared around 100,000 years ago, brains were averaging 1200 cc. And by the time anatomically modern Homo sapiens appeared around 300,000 years ago, average brain size had reached about 1350 cc, where it remains today. This is a tripling of brain size in 3 million years, which is fast by evolutionary standards. It represents a massive investment of resources. Brains are expensive. They consume about 20% of our metabolic energy, despite being only 2% of our body weight. They require enormous amounts of high-quality nutrition, particularly in childhood. They make childbirth dangerous because large heads have to pass through the birth canal. They require extended childhoods for all that brain tissue to develop and be educated. There must have been strong selective pressure to make this costly investment worthwhile. What was that pressure? The standard explanations include tool use, social complexity, language, and culture. Larger brains allow for more sophisticated tool creation and use, which improves hunting and foraging success. Larger brains allow for more complex social cognition, the ability to track relationships, remember who did what to whom, form coalitions, engage in cooperation and competition. Larger brains enable language, which allows for the transmission of knowledge across generations and the coordination of group activities, and larger brains enable culture, the cumulative ratchet of knowledge and technology building on previous generations' innovations. All of these explanations are valid and well supported by evidence. But there's something about the speed and extent of human brain expansion that remains puzzling to some researchers. It happened fast, much faster than you'd expect from gradual selection for incremental improvements. And it happened in parallel across multiple hominin lineages. It's not just Homo sapiens that has a large brain. Neanderthals had brains as large or larger than ours. Denisovans probably did too. Even earlier hominins like Homo heidelbergensis were well on their way. Brain expansion was a trend across the entire human lineage, suggesting strong, consistent selection pressure operating for millions of years. But the initial observation remains interesting. There are aspects of the human genome that are, if not anomalous, at least unexpected. Our chromosome 2, for instance, is a fusion of two ancestral ape chromosomes. It's one of the most compelling pieces of evidence for common descent with apes, but it also means humans have 46 chromosomes, while chimpanzees and other great apes have 48. Something happened in our lineage, a chromosomal fusion event that became fixed in the population. This isn't genetic engineering by aliens, it's natural evolution, but it is a significant genetic change, a restructuring of our fundamental chromosomal architecture. And there's the question of the human brain. Between 2 and 3 million years ago, something happened to our lineage. Brain size began to increase dramatically, faster than would be expected by gradual natural selection alone. By 200,000 years ago, Homo sapiens had a cranial capacity averaging 30 and 50 cubic centimeters, significantly larger than any hominin before us. This encephalization happened relatively quickly in evolutionary terms. It's not inexplicable. We understand the selective pressures. Tool use, social complexity, language, all these things reward larger, more sophisticated brains. But the speed of the change is notable. Add to this the sudden appearance of behavioral modernity about 50,000 to 70,000 years ago. For hundreds of thousands of years, Homo sapiens existed as anatomically modern humans, but didn't act particularly modern. Toolkits were simple, unchanged for millennia. Then relatively suddenly, we see an explosion of innovation. Sophisticated tools, cave art, jewellery, symbolic thought, ritual burial, long-distance trade networks, music. The archaeological record shows a phase transition, a cognitive revolution that transformed our species from smart apes into something unprecedented on this planet. What caused that shift? Was it a genetic mutation? The perfection of language? Reaching a population threshold that allowed ideas to accumulate and compound? We don't know. There's debate. But something changed, and once it did, there was no going back. Now, I'm not suggesting alien genetic engineers. I'm suggesting something more subtle. What if these ancient texts, with their stories of divine beings creating humanity, are cultural memories of this transition? Not literal accounts, but mythologized recollections of a time when we became us? When something fundamental shifted in human cognition and capacity. The flood myths are even more interesting in this light. There are flood stories in virtually every ancient culture. The Mesopotamian version with Utnapishtim, the biblical Noah, the Greek Deucalion, the Hindu Manu, the Chinese Gunyu, indigenous traditions from Australia to the Americas, hundreds of cultures, many with no contact with each other, all preserving stories of a world-drowning deluge. For a long time, scholars dismissed these as coincidence, or as natural responses to localized flooding events that were then mythologized. But in the mid-20th century, something interesting happened. Geologists began to reconstruct the end of the last ice age, and they found evidence of catastrophic flooding events that would have been continental in scale. The Younger Dryas period, approximately 12,800 to 11,600 years ago, was a sudden return to near glacial conditions after the world had been warming. It was abrupt, dramatic, and devastating. The leading hypothesis for its cause is extraterrestrial impact. Not a single asteroid, but fragments of a disintegrating comet striking North America, Europe, and possibly Asia. The evidence includes a black mat layer found at archaeological sites across multiple continents, dated to the onset of the Younger Dryas, containing nanodiamonds, iridium, platinum, magnetic spherules, and charcoal from massive wildfires. This is the signature of cosmic impact. The effects would have been apocalyptic. Instant fires across vast territories, tsunamis from ocean impacts or from ice sheets carving into the sea, a nuclear winter effect as debris blocked the sun, and then the melting. When the impacts hit the Laurentide ice sheet covering North America, they would have released unimaginable quantities of fresh water into the North Atlantic, disrupting the ocean currents that regulate climate, triggering the cold snap that followed. This wasn't a localized river flood. This was planetary trauma, and it happened right at a crucial moment in human history. The Clovis culture of North America disappeared from the archaeological record at exactly this boundary. Megafauna, the mammoths and mastodons and giant sloths, went extinct. Human populations crashed. If there were people who survived this cataclysm, who witnessed the sky on fire and the waters rising and the world they knew ending, they would have told stories. And those stories would have been passed down, generation after generation, evolving, mythologizing, but preserving a core memory. We almost died. The world almost ended. Some of us survived. And perhaps, in some of those stories, in the confusion of cultural memory, the survivors became elevated, became the founders, became the gods, because from the perspective of those who came after, those who endured the apocalypse and rebuilt civilization would have seemed superhuman. They possessed knowledge of a lost world. They knew things. How to farm, how to build, how to track the stars. Where did this knowledge come from? From before? From the time before the flood? From the ancestors who, in the retelling, became taller, wiser, longer-lived, divine? This is the lost civilization hypothesis, and while it remains controversial, there's archaeological evidence that's hard to dismiss. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, dated to approximately 9600 BCE, is a massive temple complex built by hunter-gatherers. That's not supposed to be possible. The standard archaeological narrative is that complex monumental architecture requires agriculture, sedentary populations, surplus food production, social stratification. Göbekli Tepe predates all of that. It's hunter-gatherers building something that required sophisticated organization, planning, astronomical knowledge, and engineering skill. What if the standard narrative is backward? What if agriculture and cities weren't the beginning, but a rebuilding? What if there was something before, now lost beneath rising seas or eroded by millennia, and what survived was knowledge, passed down by the handful who made it through? I'm not claiming advanced civilizations with flying cars, I'm suggesting continuity. That human cognitive capacity and cultural sophistication may be older than we think, that our history may not be a simple linear progression from primitive to complex, but something messier, with rises and falls, with knowledge gained and lost and slowly rediscovered. And if that's true, then those ancient texts might be more valuable than we give them credit for. Not as literal accounts of alien contact, but as fragmentary records of deep time, of cultural memory stretching back past the edge of recorded history into the murky period when the last ice age ended and the world was remade. Let's return to the question of expiration dates. The ancient texts, across many cultures, share another theme beyond floods. They speak of ages, cycles, the Hindu concept of yugas, vast epochs lasting hundreds of thousands of years, each age declining in righteousness and human capacity until reaching the Kali Yuga, the age of darkness, where lifespans are shortest and morality lowest. Then a reset, and the cycle begins again. The Mayan long count calendar, measuring cycles of time that end and renew. The Greek concept of successive ages, gold to silver to bronze to iron, each generation lesser than the one before. This is a fundamentally different view of time than our modern progressive notion. We assume things get better. Technology advances, knowledge accumulates, we're always improving on the past, but the ancient view was often cyclical and degenerative. We're declining from a golden age, we're the inheritors of a greater past now diminished. What if they were onto something? Not literally, not with the specific mythological details, but in a broader sense. What if civilizations and perhaps species do have lifespans? What if there are limits? There's a concept in astrobiology called the Great Filter. It's a proposed solution to the Fermi paradox, the question of where all the aliens are. If the universe is so vast and old, and life seems to arise readily given the right conditions, why haven't we detected any evidence of other technological civilizations? The Great Filter hypothesis suggests there's some barrier, some challenge, that prevents life from reaching the stage of interstellar expansion. Either the filter is behind us, it's incredibly rare for life to arise, or for multicellular organisms to evolve, or for intelligence to develop, or the filter is ahead of us. Civilizations tend to self-destruct before achieving stable interstellar presence. The scary option is that the filter is ahead, that there's something about technological development that's intrinsically self-limiting. Maybe it's nuclear war, maybe it's environmental collapse, maybe it's artificial intelligence run amok, maybe it's something we haven't thought of yet. But if most civilizations hit this wall and don't survive, that would explain the silence. And maybe some of them knew it was coming. Maybe they looked at their trajectory and realized they were on borrowed time. Maybe they tried to warn their descendants. And those warnings became myths. That's admittedly speculative. But consider our own trajectory. We're living in a geological epoch some scientists call the Anthropocene, defined by human impact on Earth's climate and ecosystems. We're in the midst of a mass extinction event, the sixth in the planet's history, caused by human activity. We've developed weapons capable of destroying civilization multiple times over. We're altering the atmospheric chemistry of our planet faster than at any point in the past 6 million years. Our population has grown exponentially. Our resource consumption is unsustainable, and the systems that support billions of people are fragile, interconnected, vulnerable to cascade failure. If you're being coldly rational about it, our long-term survival prospects are uncertain. Not hopeless, but uncertain. We could make it. We could develop sustainable technologies, colonize other worlds, become a truly spacefaring species. Or we could be one of countless civilizations that arose, built impressive things, and then collapsed under the weight of their own success. And if we do have an expiration date, is it written in our DNA? Did some decision made long ago, some change in our biology or our environment set a clock ticking? The ancient texts suggest yes. The Sumerian king list tracks a decline in longevity over time. The biblical patriarchs lived for centuries before the flood, then less afterward, then less still, until eventually human lifespans stabilize at the 70 we recognize today. It's a countdown, a gradual diminishment. Is it metaphor or memory? There's another layer to consider. The Anunnaki myths don't just describe creation, they describe ongoing intervention. In many of the texts, the gods are not absent creators. They're active participants in human affairs, constantly meddling, guiding, correcting, sometimes destroying and starting over. The flood itself in the Mesopotamian version is sent by the gods specifically to wipe out humanity because we've become too numerous and too noisy. The god Enlil wants us gone, but the god Enki, who created us, can't bring himself to let his creation perish entirely, so he warns one man, Utnapishtim, who builds a boat and preserves the seed of life. This pattern repeats. Gods destroying, gods preserving, gods intervening at critical moments. It's not benign, it's management, it's maintenance. Like a farmer culling livestock or a programmer debugging code. There's affection, perhaps, from some of the gods. Enki seems to genuinely care about his creation. But there's also a utilitarian coldness. We're a project, an experiment. And experiments can be terminated if they're not working. If you strip away the supernatural elements and look at the pattern, it's a story about a created species that's kept in check, prevented from becoming too powerful, culled periodically, guided along specific paths, given just enough knowledge to be useful but not enough to be threatening. Now again, I'm not saying this is literal truth, I'm not saying there are space aliens actively managing human affairs, but I am saying that myths often encode anxieties. And this particular anxiety that we're not truly free, that our destiny is being shaped by forces beyond our comprehension, that we might be terminated if we become inconvenient, that resonates. Because at some level it's true, we're not free, we're constrained by our biology, our evolutionary history, our cognitive limitations. We're constrained by the planet we evolved on, the resources available to us, the laws of physics, we're constrained by our own social and psychological tendencies that lead to conflict, tribalism, short-term thinking. We're constrained by the technology we've developed, which empowers us but also creates new vulnerabilities. We're guided by forces we don't control: cultural evolution, mimetic transmission, economic systems, ecological relationships. And yes, we could be terminated, not by alien overlords, but by our own mistakes, or by simple cosmic bad luck, an asteroid or supervolcano or nearby supernova. The Anunnaki myth is a way of personifying these forces, of giving a face to the vast impersonal systems that shape human existence. And the expiration date is the acknowledgement that everything ends. Civilizations rise and fall, species go extinct. Even the longest-lived entities in the universe, the galaxies themselves, will eventually disperse and die. Nothing lasts forever. But here's the thing about myths. They're not just anxiety, they're also hope. Because in almost every version of these stories, someone survives. Utnapishtim survives the flood. Noah survives. Manu survives. Deucalion and Pyrrha survive. There's always a remnant, a seed that persists, and from that seed the world is remade. The myths suggest we've been through this before, that collapse is not the end, that humanity, or something recognisably human, has endured through dark ages and catastrophes before. The knowledge is lost, yes, the great works crumble, but the capacity to rebuild remains, because it's not in the buildings or the books, it's in us, in the accumulated genetic and cultural inheritance of our species. As long as some of us survive, the story continues. So maybe the expiration date isn't about the species, maybe it's about configurations, a particular civilization, a particular way of organising society, a particular set of technologies and beliefs. Those have expiration dates. They rise, flourish and collapse, but the people endure. Changed certainly, reduced often, but not erased. And maybe that's the real message encoded in the Anunnaki myths and the king list and all the ancient stories of declining ages and cyclical time. We're mortal. Our civilizations are mortal. But the human project, the experiment of conscious, tool-using, storytelling beings trying to make sense of an indifferent universe, that's ongoing. It predates our current global civilization and it will likely survive whatever comes next. There's a strange comfort in that. Not reassurance exactly, but perspective. Close your eyes now, fully. Let the weight of this settle. You're lying in the dark in the early hours of the 21st century, in a world more connected and technologically sophisticated than any in human history. And yet you're part of a continuity that stretches back through the Sumerians, back through the Younger Dryas catastrophe, back through the cognitive revolution, back through the long, slow dawn of human consciousness. You carry genetic material that's billions of years old, shaped by every extinction event and evolutionary pressure since life began. You carry cultural material, language, stories, ideas that have been passed down for thousands of generations. You are, in a very real sense, one of the Anunnaki's experiments, if they existed, but they probably didn't. What exists is the force they represent, evolution, the pitiless selection of genes and traits, the winnowing of populations through environmental pressure, the cosmic indifference that allows life to flourish when conditions are right and snuffs it out when they're not. You're a product of that, shaped by it, constrained by it, but also empowered by it, because you're the current iteration of a process that has been learning, adapting, improving for 4 billion years. And maybe you don't have an expiration date. Not personally, you do, of course, everyone dies, but the information you carry, genetic and cultural, that persists. It changes, recombines, mutates, but it continues. You're a link in a chain that extends backward into deep time and forward into a future we can't see. The chain might break, the whole experiment might fail, but it hasn't yet. Against all odds, through multiple extinction events and planetary catastrophes, something persisted. Something survived. And here you are. The Sumerians are gone. Their cities are ruins. Their language was forgotten for thousands of years, only recently deciphered. But their ideas persist. Their cuneiform script evolved into other writing systems that became the alphabet you're reading now. Their base 60 mathematics survives in how we measure time and angles. Their myths influenced Babylonian myths that influenced Hebrew myths that became the biblical narratives that shaped Western civilization. They created the template for urban civilization, for law, for literature, for astronomy, for bureaucracy, For a lot of what we still recognize as civilization, they've been dead for 4,000 years and they're still here. In the structures we use, in the stories we tell, in the questions we ask. If the Anunnaki existed, they failed to build immortal kings. The lifespans declined, the divine blood diluted, the connection to heaven was lost. But they succeeded in creating something that replicates, that learns, that adapts, that finds new niches and new ways to survive. Us. And maybe that's what the expiration date really means. Not that we end, but that we transform. Each age expires. Each configuration of human society runs its course. But the underlying pattern, the self-replicating information system we call life, keeps generating new expressions, new experiments, new possibilities. The world ends regularly on different scales. Individual death, civilizational collapse, mass extinction, cosmic catastrophe. But the universe keeps producing complexity, keeps exploring the space of possible configurations, keeps running the experiment. You're part of that, one iteration, one fleeting pattern in the foam. Here for a moment, then gone, but not meaningless. Because you're connected to everything that came before and everything that comes after. You're the Anunnaki's descendant, if you want to think of it that way. Or you're evolution's current best guess. Or you're the universe waking up to contemplate itself. Pick your mythology. They're all pointing to the same thing. You're here, conscious, aware, able to look back at those clay tablets pressed 5,000 years ago and read the anxiety of the people who made them, who wondered about their origins and their purpose and how long they would last. And you can recognize that anxiety because it's yours too. We're still asking the same questions. We're still uncertain about the answers, but we're still here asking. That has to count for something. The night is deep now. The questions are too big for answers. They have always been too big. The Sumerians knew that. That's why they made gods, not because gods are real, but because some questions need a story rather than a solution. How did we get here? The gods made us. Why do we suffer? The gods demand it. What happens when we die? We're judged by the Anunnaki. It's not true, but it's functional. It lets you live with the uncertainty. We've replaced those gods with other stories. Evolution, the Big Bang, emergent complexity, thermodynamic gradients. These are better stories in that they're testable, falsifiable, predictive. They let us build technology and cure diseases and understand our place in the cosmos more accurately. But they don't resolve the existential weight. They don't answer why there's something rather than nothing, or why the universe permits conscious beings, or what it means that we can ask these questions at all. So we're back where the Sumerians were, telling stories, pressing symbols into wet clay, or encoding them in electromagnetic patterns, or transmitting them through sound waves in the night. The medium changes, but the act doesn't. We're storytelling animals, it's what we do, it's maybe what we're for if we're for anything, and that's okay, that's enough. The Anunnaki don't need to be real for the story to be valuable. The expiration date doesn't need to be literal for the anxiety it represents to be valid. We're mortal. Everything we build is temporary. The universe will continue long after our last descendant has died and our sun has gone dark and every atom that was once part of a human being has been scattered to the cosmic winds. That's just physics. That's just truth. But right now, in this moment, you're here, thinking, feeling, connected to a web of meaning and relationship and history that spans the planet and reaches back to the origins of life. And tomorrow you'll wake up and continue the story. You'll make choices, create things, connect with others, learn something new, contribute to the ongoing conversation that is human culture. You're writing the next chapter of the experiment, not because you're special, but because you're here. And being here means you matter. Your life is one more data point in the great pattern, one more variation that might or might not be selected for, one more voice in the chorus. And maybe that's the answer the ancient texts are pointing toward. Not that we're slaves to alien gods or genetic experiments with programmed obsolescence, but that we're part of something larger than ourselves, part of a process, participants in the unfolding of complexity and consciousness in the universe. The expiration date isn't a countdown to termination. It's a reminder that this phase is temporary, that nothing stays the same, that everything is always in flux. But flux is not meaningless. It's how new things emerge. It's how life explores possibility space. You're a fleeting pattern, yes, but you're a beautiful one, intricate and unlikely, shaped by billions of years of selection and chance, conscious of your own existence, capable of wonder. That's not nothing. That's extraordinary. And it persists, in different forms, through the ages. The Sumerians are gone, but their wonder remains. Their questions echo, their stories inform ours, and someday our civilization will be ruins too. Puzzles for future archaeologists, and they'll find our myths, our stories, our questions, and they'll recognize themselves in us. Because the questions don't change, only the answers we pretend to have. So rest now. You followed the thread back as far as it goes, to the first cities, the first writings, the first attempts to explain where we came from and why we're here, and you found what everyone finds: mystery, uncertainty, the profound discomfort of consciousness in a universe that doesn't seem to care, but also connection, continuity, the recognition that you're part of an ancient lineage of beings who looked up at the stars and wondered, who pressed stories into clay and passed them down, who survived catastrophes and rebuilt, who endured. You're their heir. Carry it forward, for however long your chapter lasts. That's all any of us can do. That's what the Anunnaki, real or understood. The experiment continues. The story isn't over. The ziggurat in Uruk is gone now, reduced to foundations and academic reconstructions. But the impulse that built it remains, the need to reach towards something greater, to connect earth and heaven, to leave a mark that says we were here, we mattered, we tried to understand. You're doing the same thing, just listening to this in the dark, reaching out, trying to connect, trying to understand your place in the vast machinery of time and space and existence. And in that reaching, in that trying, you're fulfilling whatever purpose you might have, not because an alien species programmed it into your dem, but because consciousness, once it emerges, can't help but ask, can't help but seek, can't help but try to make meaning in a universe that might not have any. That's not slavery. That's freedom. The terrifying, exhilarating freedom of being a conscious being in an indifferent cosmos. You get to decide what matters. You get to create meaning. You get to write your own chapter in the ongoing story of Earth's experiment with complex life. And when your chapter ends, as all chapters do, the story will continue, changed by your presence, shaped by the choices you made and the connections you formed and the things you created and the love you shared. That's your legacy, not immortality, but participation. You are here. You are part of this. That has to be enough because it's all any of us get. The Anunnaki, if they existed, learned this too. They couldn't escape time. They couldn't prevent the decline recorded in the king list. They couldn't stop the flood. They couldn't maintain their control forever. Even gods are mortal in the long run. Even gods are temporary patterns subject to entropy, but their creation survived them, adapted, evolved, spread across the planet, reached for the stars. We outlived our makers, whether those makers were gods or evolutionary processes or some complex interaction of both, and we'll outlive the current configuration too. The 21st century will become ancient history. Our myths will be studied by future beings of Osisian trying to understand what we believed and why. And they'll find the same patterns we found in Sumerian myths. Anxiety about origins and destiny. Attempts to understand suffering and mortality. Stories to make sense of the senseless. That's the real continuity. Not genetic, though that's part of it. Not cultural, though that matters too. But the continuity of consciousness itself. The flame of awareness passing from generation to generation, each one adding fuel, each one keeping it lit a little longer, each one passing it forward before the darkness comes. You're a torchbearer. Whether you asked for it or not, whether you feel worthy or not, you're carrying the light of consciousness through your brief moment in time, and then you'll pass it to whoever comes next. That's the human condition. That's the Anunnaki's legacy, if they existed. That's the result of 4 billion years of evolution. And it's not a burden. It's a gift, because in carrying that light, you get to see, you get to experience, you get to know wonder and love and beauty and meaning, even if those things are temporary, even if they're ultimately patterns in neurons that will disperse. You get to be here, now, aware, alive. That's what matters, not the expiration date. But the fact that right now, in this moment, you are. The rest is commentary, important commentary useful for navigating the world, building civilizations, curing diseases, exploring space. But the fundamental fact is your existence in this moment. Your consciousness encountering the universe. That's the irreducible core. That's what can't be taken away or diminished by any expiration date, real or imagined. So rest in that. Rest in the simple, profound fact of your own being. The Anunnaki can't touch it. Time can't diminish it. Even death, when it comes, can only end this particular configuration. The pattern that generated you will continue generating new configurations, new expressions, new experiments. You're a wave in an ocean that's been rolling for eons and will continue long after your wave has passed. That's not nothing. That's everything. That's all there is. And it's enough. Sleep now. Dream of ancient cities and distant stars. Dream of beings, human or otherwise, asking the same questions you ask. Dream of the long chain of consciousness stretching back through the ages and forward into the unknown future. You're a link in that chain. Strong enough, bright enough, good enough. The expiration date, whatever it is, isn't today. And tomorrow, when you wake, you'll write another page. Add another note to the song, carry the light a little further. That's your inheritance from the Anunnaki. Not alien DNA or programmed slavery, but the gift and burden of consciousness. The ability to know you're here, to matter, to choose, to create, to love, to question, to endure. Use it well for however long you have, and when you're gone, may the story you added to the great conversation be one worth telling. May the light you carried burn bright enough to guide someone else through their own darkness. May you be remembered, or if not remembered, may the effects of your existence ripple forward in ways you can't predict or imagine, shaping the future in subtle but real ways. That's immortality, if such a thing exists, not living forever, but mattering now in ways that echo. The Sumerians matter. 4,000 years dead, and they're here with us tonight. Their questions alive, their anxiety recognizable, their stories still teaching. They had expiration dates. They met them. They didn't disappear. They're woven into the fabric of everything that came after. You will be too. The pattern you make, the choices you take, the love you give, the questions you ask, all of it feeds forward. All of it shapes what comes next. You're not just a consumer of history. You're a creator of it. Every moment, every choice, that's the real revelation. Not that we're slaves to ancient astronauts, but that we're free, terrifyingly, beautifully free. Free to choose meaning in a meaningless universe. Free to create value in a valueless cosmos. Free to matter because we decide to matter. That's the human superpower. That's what evolved over millions of years and was refined through countless catastrophes and expressed through Sumerian scribes and carried forward to you. Consciousness, choice, meaning-making, storytelling, love. These aren't programmed, they're emergent. They are what happens when complexity reaches a certain threshold and systems start to know themselves. The universe waking up, looking at itself, asking why, and then inventing answers, knowing they're invented, but telling them anyway because the telling is the point, the reaching is the point, the trying is the point. You're the universe doing that, right now, in this moment, and it's magnificent, even if it's temporary, especially because it's temporary. The sunset is beautiful because it fades. The flower matters because it blooms for a day. The life is precious because it ends. That's not cruel. That's what makes it real. That's what makes it count. So count while you're here. Matter ferociously, love recklessly, question everything, create something, connect deeply, carry the light, add your voice to the song, write your chapter, live your truth. And when the expiration date comes, whenever it comes, go knowing you participated. You were here, you mattered, you were part of the great experiment. You were one of the Anunnaki's descendants, or evolution's children, or the universe's way of knowing itself. You were consciousness, briefly embodied, doing its best in an impossible situation. That's enough. That's more than enough. That's everything. Rest now, sleep deep, dream of ancient gods and future beings, dream of the chain you're part of stretching back to the first cities and forward to the stars. You're a link, strong and bright and necessary. The story continues tomorrow. Your chapter is still being written. But tonight, rest. The universe can wait. The questions can wait. The anxiety about expiration dates and origins and purposes can wait. Right now, you're here, breathing, being. That's the answer to everything. That's what the Anunnaki were trying to create. That's what evolution produced. That's what the universe permits and maybe even desires. Consciousness, you, here, now. Perfect, complete, enough.